All right, so this lesson, solving quadratics by completing the square, part 2, comes from chapter 9, section 5 in my student's textbook. Part 1, if you want to go back and look at that, you should look at that first before watching part 2. In part 1, we solved quadratics by completing the square when there wasn't a coefficient on the x squared term. So in this one, I'm going to go back and look at what do you do if there's a coefficient on the squared variable. So that's what this lesson's about. I'm going to do a quick review problem of completing the square when there's not a coefficient. All right, so I'm not going to go over this because I did in part 1. So you can read that if you want. I'm going to move on to example 1. And this example actually was the same example 1 in the part 1 lesson, but I just wanted to review this real quick. So when you're trying to solve a quadratic by completing the square, what you want to do is find out what the value of b over 2 squared is. Again, if you go back and watch part 1 of this, this would make more sense. So b over 2 squared, my b value here is 6. So 6 over 2 squared. So that's 3 squared, which is 9. And then you take this and you add it to both sides of the equation. So remember, you can do whatever you want to an equation as long as you do it to both sides. So x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals 216 plus 9. And so now that we completed the square, now this can easily be factored to x plus 3 squared. That was the whole point of doing this. So this b over 2 squared term, that allows you to complete the square and factor it to this. And so that equals 225. Again, just real quick, if I take that x plus 3 and multiply times x plus 3, and I FOIL this, you would get x squared plus 3x plus 3x plus 9, which is x squared plus 6x plus 9. So this is the factor of that, okay? I just want to show that to you real quick, in case you're wondering where this x plus 3 came from. It's just the square root of this last term. The plus sign comes from this sign. So if this was a minus sign, this would be a minus. All right, so now back to solving this. Next, what we want to do is take the square root of both sides. So I'm trying to solve this equation for x. So that gives me x plus 3 equals the square root of 225 is positive or negative 15. And then I just break this apart into the two equations. So x plus 3 could be equal to 15, or x plus 3 could be equal to negative 15. And then you just solve these two equations to get your two solutions. So both of these are subtracting 3 from both sides. So this one I would get x equals 12, and this one I would get x equals negative 18. And that's my solutions. And you can check those. So don't forget that. You can take 12 and plug it in and do 12 squared plus 6 times 12, and it should come out to 216. And you can likewise plug in the negative 18 and check that. All right, so that's really a review of part 1. So in this lesson, now we're going to look at what if there's a coefficient on the squared variable. So what if there was a coefficient in front of the x squared here? So here we go. Okay, so first off, we talked about this in part 1. If your c value is over here, the first thing you need to do is move it over to the other side. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to add 10 to both sides. And so that leaves me with 2y squared minus 8y equals 10. All right, so now what do we do with that coefficient on the y squared there? How are we going to handle that? Well, we're simply just going to divide it away. So we're going to divide both sides of the equation by that coefficient of 2. Be careful, make sure that you divide everything by 2 here. All right, a lot of times students will forget to divide the 8y by 2. So those cancel each other out, simplifies to just 1. So that leaves me with y squared minus 4y equals 5. And now I have a problem just like the first example that we did. So we're going to proceed just like we did there. So we're going to find out what that b divided by 2 squared value is. So that's negative 4 divided by 2, and square that. So that'd be negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4. So I'm going to add this value to both sides to complete the square. So that gives me y squared minus 4y plus 4 equals 5 plus 4. All right, so again, the reason I did that is because now I can easily factor this to y minus 2 squared. The 2 came from the square root of 4, the minus sign came from here. And again, if you multiply y minus 2 times y minus 2, you'll find that you end up back with this. And that's equal to 9. All right, so we're going to take the square root of both sides now, solving this for y. The whole point of this is solving the quadratic, finding out what the value of y is. This is just one method of doing it. In the previous section in my textbook, we went over how to do it using factoring. So now we have y minus 2 equals positive or negative 3. All right, so I break this apart into y minus 2 equals positive 3, or y minus 2 equals negative 3. Solve these equations by adding 2 to both sides, and I'll end up with the solutions of y equals 5 or y equals negative 1. And again, you can plug those in and check them. So if you were taking a test and you had extra time, I would definitely encourage you to plug those in and check them. All right, so let's look at another example. This one, not quite as clean as this one. I'll leave it at that. All right, so again, the first thing I want to do is move the c over to the other side. So I'm going to add 44 to both sides. All right, so now I have 4w squared plus 12w equals 44. Now I want to get rid of that coefficient on the w squared. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And again, I'm going to divide everything by 4 here. Don't forget that. Okay, so those cancel out. Now I'm left with w squared plus 3w equals 11. And now we want to complete the square. So we're going to go find that b divided by 2 squared. So b divided by 2 squared equals 3 divided by 2 squared, which equals 9/4. And so that's why I said this one's not quite as clean as the last one. There's fractions involved here, but don't let the fractions worry you. If you're doing this level of math, you probably have a calculator that can handle the fractions, so you can just plug them in. Okay, so take advantage of that. If your teacher allows you to use a calculator, use the fraction button. All right, and if you don't know how to use the fraction button, if you Google it and put in your calculator type, it'll show you really quickly how to do it. You can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with fractions using your calculator. So we're going to add this 9/4 to both sides. W squared plus 3w plus 9/4 equals 11 plus 9/4. All right, so we're going to factor this. Again, it's a plus sign because of this plus sign, and then we just take the square root of 9/4, which is just the square root of 9 over the square root of 4. So that's 3/2. And then add 11 and 9/4 together. Again, your calculator can most likely do that for you. If not, you just need to find a common denominator and add the numerators. And now we're going to take the square root of both sides. Oh, I forgot to put my squared there. Take the square root of both sides. And so now I have w plus 3/2 equals, and I should have said in the instructions here, typically on a problem like this, it's going to tell you to round your answer if necessary. In my textbook, it says round your answer to the nearest hundredth if necessary. So when we take the square root here, we're going to do the square root of 53/4, and it's going to come out to a decimal. And we're going to round that to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so it comes out to positive or negative, I'm looking for it, 3.64, 3 64 hundredths. Okay, so now we're going to split this apart into our two equations. So scroll this down. So I have w plus 3/2 equals positive 3.64, or w plus 3/2 equals negative 3.64. So you're going to solve this by subtracting 3/2 from each side. And the solutions you're going to get are going to be w equals 2 14 hundredths, or on this side, again, subtract 3/2 from both sides, w equals negative 5 14 hundredths. All right, I got one more example for you. If you're good, then you don't need to watch the last example, but if you'd like one more, here it is. All right, so again, the first thing I'm gonna do is get the c over on the other side. So I'm gonna add 20 to both sides. This one you'll notice it's a little bit different. Instead of this being equal to 0 here, there's actually a number there, but that's okay. We're just gonna add the 20 to that number. So we're gonna end up with 2v squared minus 10v equals 28. Again, now we need to get rid of that coefficient on the v squared, so we're going to divide both sides by 2, that coefficient. So divide by 2, and again, make sure you divide everything by 2. And so I'm left with v squared minus 5v equals 14. Now I'm going to figure out the b value, or the b over 2 squared value, the value I need to complete the square. So b over 2 squared equals negative 5 over 2 squared. So multiply negative 5/2 times negative 5/2, and you get positive 25/4. So again, a fraction, but that's okay. Don't freak out about the fractions. So then I have v squared minus 5v. So again, I'm going to add this to both sides. Plus 25/4 equals 14 plus 25/4. So go ahead and factor this. So it's a minus sign because of this minus sign. Take the square root of the numerator, square root of the denominator, and you get 5/2. And then 14 plus 25/4, that comes out to 81/4. Again, you can just put that in your calculator. 14 plus 25/4, it'll give you this. And most calculators, it might give you the answer as a decimal, but there's a button that you can push that'll switch it back into, actually your calculator will probably give it to you as a mixed number, but there's a button you can push that'll change it back to an improper fraction. So again, if you just Google those, you'll find out how to work fractions in your calculator. And if you didn't know how to do it, it'll make your life a whole lot easier. So we're going to solve this by taking the square root of both sides. All right, so now I have v minus 5/2 equals the square root of 81/4. Actually comes out to a pretty nice number. Positive or negative 4.5. Square root of 81 is 9. Square root of 4 is 2. 9 halves is the same thing as 4.5. So now we're going to split this apart. So v minus 5 halves equals positive 4.5, or v minus 5 halves equals negative 4 5/10. Solve both of these by adding 5 halves to both sides. So for this one, your solution will come out to v equals 7. Add 5 halves to negative 4/5, and you'll get v equal to negative 2. And again, you can plug those in and check them, especially if you have a test and you have extra time. I would recommend you do that. All right, so I hope that this helped you out and you found this useful. If so, please give it a like and subscribe. And until next time.